A Kitsune in Remnant by Red the Devil 360, Chapter 8, A Friend in Need. Naruto flicked a page in his book as he hung upside down from the ceiling. He was bored, incredibly so. It was nearing the summer break and exams were coming up, but he didn't really need to worry about passing them, so revision was at a minimum, much to the frustration of his teammates. Having had a life filled with action and adventure up until this point, and then suddenly turning it down to zero was really hard to get used to. Of course, there were things that he could read it like he was doing now, train or practice his seals, but they all got old really quick, and his little bonsai tree was in pristine condition. Being a shinobi, one didn't have a lot of time on his hands to gain significant hobbies. Most of the time he was devoted to surviving in his early years and training in his later ones. Of course, the war didn't help, but everyone else was in the same boat, so it was a moot point. Things had been quiet since he and Blake had taken out an operation by the White Fang, and the girl in question had been rather subdued since. Not that she was rather outgoing in the first place. Yang, although not a friend yet, was at least being cordial with him, and he easily returned the favor. She didn't outright ignore or insult him as she did, and even held conversations with him, so it was a large difference. It was a lot of fun when she discovered that he pranked his village back when he was younger. That school week will go down in the history books as the most chaotic ever recorded. Not even Ospen was spared their wrath. Whis, on the other hand, acted like his namesake. She was cold, ice cold, and Naruto preferred it that way. They both ignored each other, and Naruto simply wanted it to stay that way. He was still bored, however. I'm bored! Apparently he wasn't the only one. Ruby was also hanging upside down and kicking her legs in boredom, although she was on her bed rather than the ceiling, something she found incredibly unfair. Yes, we know you have said so for the past hour, Blake commented dryly from her own bed, flicking a page in her own book. Oh, come on, Blakey, we all know you're bored as well. Yang spoke up, her hair falling around her head like a curtain as she was also hanging off the bed. Blake sighed and closed her book with a snap. It was true. She was also bored. The words on the page were barely talking to her at this point. What do you propose then, Yang? Yang shrugged. I don't know. Something, anything is better than this. How about Vale? We've been there so many times now that even I could probably walk the city blindfolded. Naruto spoke up from the ceiling. Yang snorted. Well then, what do you want to do? Naruto shrugged as well. I don't know. I never really had the time to be bored back home between the war and training, and I don't really feel like training properly at the moment. I'm still bored, Ruby moaned again. Naruto sighed and closed his book. Sometimes when I train, I like to fight multiple opponents to get used to what real combat was like, and although I don't really feel like training, we could do a battle royale. You lot against me? Maybe even invite Periwinkle and make it a 7-on-1, he proposed, jumping back to the ground with a little mid-air roll. Everyone perked up at the thought. It was an interesting proposition. That actually sounds like a good idea, Yang admitted. Brew was suddenly in front of him in a flurry of rose petals. Oh, I'll go and see if Periwinkle wants to come. You go and secure us a training room large enough to do this, so she instructed excitedly before flying out the room once more. Naruto rolled his shoulders as he stood opposite the small gathering of people opposite, all decked in their combat gear. So how are we going to do this? To, you want me to give you 5 minutes to think of a plan, or should I just say go? The group looked amongst them for a moment before Power replied, "Can we do multiple rounds?" Naruto shrugged. "If you want, then just say when." Naruto chuckled and unsheathed his ninjato, preferring to leave his tanto in his sheath for now. "Come, show me what you're capable of," he spoke, inciting the group to attack him at once. They did as such. Ruby was first to arrive with the use of her semblance, being one of his teammates and partner. Naruto had the chance to fight each of his teammates in different fashions and learn each of their particular methods of fighting. For example, Yang was the poster girl for the brawler type, much like himself when he first became a genin, power over everything else. Ruby was the opposite. While she did possess some strength, speed was her strongest area. If the enemy can't hit you, how can they win? Blake was the rogue, using clones to mislead people and attacking when their back was turned. She was incredibly skilled in that regard, and though she had not possessed aura and a semblance, he would have pinned her for a shinobi. And then there was him. He was everything rolled into one. He was far from the brawler he once was years ago, and now possessed a devastating taijutsu style that possessed unbroken bones and disabling his opponents and deadly counterattacks. That doesn't mean he neglected his speed, however. He shared Ruby's philosophy about being fast enough where his opponents couldn't hit him, and was now one of the fastest shinobi in the elemental nations, second only to perhaps the fourth Raikage, though since they never had a race, it was hard to tell. And of course, stabbing people in the back was kind of what a shinobi did. They practically wrote the book on it. Naruto dodged the first strike from Ruby in a blur to match her own before using his blade to deflect another, putting her off balance, allowing him to calmly knock her to the ground in preparation for his next opportunities. He didn't wait long and was forced to defend himself against the dual assaults from both Blake and Yang, the two partners working in sync to press back the shinobi. Naruto ducked under a swipe from Yang and deflected a strike from Blake into the path of an approaching Pyra, stopping both in their tracks. He took the opportunity to block two jabs from Yang with the flat of his blade and slammed his palm into her nose with his spare hand, knocking her out of the fight for the time being. He easily stepped to the side and allowed the glyph-empowered Whis to speed past, sticking his leg out as she went, sending her into a recently recovered Ruby. Naruto backflipped in time for Madhilda to slam into the ground where he previously stood. He landed and was immediately beset by Ren, who was soon joined by Blake, Nora, and Pyra. Naruto smiled. He was enjoying this. The combined attacks from the four were pushing him to actually focus on his defenses rather than the lazy method before. The others seemed to notice as well and pushed the attack, confidence shining through with each strike. He of course couldn't let that continue. His first move was to trap Magnhild. When Nora once again struck the group, he placed the foot on the hammer and used it to land a knee into the girl's chin, both disarming her and sending her out to fight. He next ducked under a swipe from Blake and used his forearm to halt the return swing. He kicked the back of her knee, making her kneel, and used her sword arm to block an attack from Pyra while he blocked one from Ren. He disarmed Blake and kicking her into Pyra, knocking both down and out before chucking the sword at an approaching Yang, forcing her to dodge rather than attack him. He dodged a few strikes from Ren and hooked his blade between the blade and trigger of Stormflower and disarmed the man before ruthlessly roundhouse kicking the man in the chest, knocking him out of the fight. In a few seconds, he just wiped out four people. He took a small breather as the last three, Whis, Yang, and Ruby, gathered themselves opposite him. He twirled his sword a few times to release a bit of tension in his wrist, a good twist not many knew. Besides, it also looked cool. This prompted both sisters to attack their teammate while we supported them with speed boosts from her semblance. Ruby was the first to reach him and block a few strikes from her while simultaneously dodging dust rounds from Whis. He leant out of the way of a swing and parried a jab from Yang, sending an elbow in response, catching the blonde in her well-endowed chest. Not that it cushioned the blow any. The girl landed in the ground in a winded heap, but the distraction allowed Ruby back into the fight and was forced on the defensive from a brief moment before he disarmed her also. She tried fighting with what she had learned from his hand-to-hand lessons, but he easily slapped aside her punches and swept her feet out from under her, crouching down to pat her on the head as a way to tell her she was out. And then there was one, he commented, standing to face Whis. She narrowed her eyes and used the glyph to launch her at her opponent. With a great cry, Naruto smirked underneath his mask, easily blocking the strike the girl sent his way, only serving to make the girl more agitated. A black glyph formed underneath him, throwing him into the air. However, Naruto was not dissuaded and simply twirled to land on his feet. The moment he did so, and the glyphs appeared around him, and he spotted Whis racing at him with her rapier ready. She used the glyph to attack from every angle available, but no matter how hard she tried, Naruto was always there to block them. the last glyph she sent her remaining aura into overpowered it, shooting herself at Naruto with greater speed than before. Yet he still stepped aside, leaving his knee in her path to connect to her stomach, stopping her dead. Whis collapsed to her knees, gaping in the attempt to not throw up her lunch. She tried to reach for her rapier where she dropped it, but froze when the blade pressed itself at her throat, and she looked up to the wilder where Naruto stood with an eyebrow cocked as she sighed and bowed her head in a sigh of defeat, clearly disappointed. Not bad, everyone. Not bad at all. Naruto congratulated, returning his sword to its sheath on his back. I thought you weren't going to be serious, Yang groaned from the ground where she still lay. Naruto snorted. I wasn't. If I was, she wouldn't even get a chance to attack before you would be down and out. Ruby pouted. It's still unfair. Naruto chuckled. All right, I suppose I can handicap myself. Mix things up a little. He clapped his hands together. Come on up. Round two. He encouraged, getting groans in return, much to his amusement. Blake awoke around 9 as she usually did on the weekends, and immediately something was off. Kitsune was not in the room. Although it was not uncommon, the man had admitted that he sometimes got carried away with training and was later back. His swords were still present in the room and his desks were left untouched. It was almost eerie, as if he had just up and disappeared. She didn't dwell on it for long in the end. Shinobi were mysterious people after all. Things didn't change throughout the day, however, causing both his team and Periwinkle to begin to worry. Bearing Weiss, though she was dragged along, he didn't turn up for lunch, team training, or now dinner. He wasn't in the library or in any of the training grounds, nor was he outside in the gardens where he sometimes liked to meditate. It was when the sun began to set that they finally decided to seek help. Yes, I'm aware of Kitsune's position. However, he asked that he not be disturbed even by you, Aspen said, staring at the group of assembled students before him. Ruby frowned. Do you know why? The concern of her teammate evident in her voice. Aspen shook his head. He didn't deem me important enough to say, he replied. Ruby sighed and nodded her head. Is he safe? She asked hopefully. This time Osmond nodded. He is still on the grounds in the school grounds, so you have nothing to worry about, Miss Rose, or any of you, he reassured. Now is there anything else you would like to ask? He prompted. Ruby, Para, and Blake each perked up slightly. Nothing had came of the months on end of research, and they had eventually given up on any hope to find the truth. Perhaps the headmaster knew something. Actually, we were wondering if there was anything you could tell us about the war, Para asked, confidence back in her words. Osmond cocked an eyebrow while on the inside he smiled slightly. And what makes you I know anything? If you knew that I was in the White Fang, then you may know something that happened to create a war of that scale. Blake spoke up, supporting her friend. Osmond sighed and turned off the computer screen in front of him. Very well, but what I am about to say does not leave this room, Osmond asked, and no commanded them, and received nervous nods in return. Just what were they about to hear? 7 years ago, the number of dust mines closing down compared to one's opening increased by nearly 35%. A few months ago, that statistic was doubled. Austin began already shocking the students. Scientists in secret conducted extensive studies and came to a rather frightening conclusion. Remnant is running out of dust. Are you saying that in a few years that there will be no more dust in Remnant? Yang asked with a pale face, as many others had. The man nodded. Why keep it a secret then? Surely the people must be told, Ruby asked in confusion. Because there'd be anarchy, Weiss whispered, causing the group to turn towards her. Think about it, everything runs on dust, from military-grade weapons to health care. Even our toothbrushes. If the people heard that we're running out of our most valued resources, there would be widespread panic across the Four Kingdoms. We may never recover from it. Aptly put, Miss Weiss, Osmond commented. It was determined that we've become so reliant on dust that the planet simply can't replenish it fast enough. Many theories were proposed and shot down over the next couple years before finally there was one that seemed plausible. An expedition founded by the Snee Dust Company to find a new continent with the possibility of holding dust. And they did, Pyro whispered. Osmond nodded. What happened? Where did it go wrong? Nora was oddly quiet at the moment. What happened was that we found natives on the continent. His eyes drifted to Reese momentarily. As the SDC was the main backer of the trip, Atlas got the took the majority of the members that went on the expedition. That turned out to be a mistake. Instead of treating with the natives and making friends on a foreign land, they forced them into manual labor. Child or elderly didn't matter. They killed all that opposed them. Weiss couldn't get any paler. She would be so see-through, though there was a green tint. That certainly explains what he said, Ruby mumbled, the others far too shocked to say much else. Of course, word escaped what was happening, and the natives responded with force, and within 3 months, what remained of the expedition retreated back here with tales of hostile natives that attacked them, and soon as they landed, despite peaceful intentions, the rest is, as they say, history. Osman concluded. The sound of someone heaving up could cut through the heaving silence that followed. Everyone collectively turned to Weiss, who was hunched over a bin and was clearly throwing up into it. Apparently overwhelmed by what her family had done, Ruby, ever the optimist, rushed to her aid and began holding her hair and rubbing small circles around her back, while the others stayed back and not entirely sure how to feel. "Did they ever find dust there?" Blake asked quietly, tearing her eyes away from the slightly pleasing sight of the Schnee heiress being sick. That that must be the worst part, for they did not miss Belladonna. Millions of lives were lost for nothing. No wonder he hates me, Weiss whispered quietly. Despite the silence of the room, they still had to strain themselves to hear her as she sat shaking in Ruby's arms, public decorum forgotten. "Thank you, Headmaster," Pyra spoke as she and Ruby helped Weiss to walk. Hospen was silent until they reached the lift. "You'll find kids soon on the dorm roof balcony," he revealed to the gobsmacked students. They had apparently not thought there. Naruto took another swig of his sake bottle only to realize that it was empty and threw it carelessly behind him, adding to the pile that had long since been building up, only to unseal another and begin drinking that too. He couldn't get drunk, sadly, only slightly. That was even when asking Kyubi to halt his healing process. His naturally high Uzumaki metabolism was more than enough for a few drinks, and by a few he meant a couple dozen. He gripped the blue jewel in his hand tighter at the reminder of why he started in the first place. He went to take another sip, but stopped. "I thought I told Allspin I didn't want to be disturbed," he spoke. "We were worried about you. You've been missing the whole day, and we couldn't find you." Naruto snorted and took another swig. Ever wonder if that was by design? He turned to look at the assembled students that had come onto the roof. Even Weiss was there, but she wouldn't meet his eyes. "I suppose you know, then?" They simply nodded. "Good." He finished off his drink and chucked the empty bottle behind him again, although whether it was the alcohol or not, he missed and it flew off the side. He at least had the decency to wince when he heard it hit someone. Sighing, he unsealed another once again, but stopped and turned back to the students. "Why are you still here?" They looked confused at the question. "What do you mean? We want to know what's wrong," Ruby asked. "Course you do," they heard him utter before drinking again. "Please, Kitsune, let us help you," Pyra pleaded. She wanted to know what was wrong with him. After learning what her people did to his, she felt she owed it to her first friend, or to at least understand why he was clearly in pain. Naruto looked down slightly at the raw emotion behind her voice and sighed. "Today would have been my anniversary," he said quietly, looking out to the setting sun as it cast golden colors across the sky. The gentle breeze filled the silence that filled it. It seemed that today was full of revelations that made them do that. They were silent for what seemed like an eternity before someone gathered the courage to speak up. "Who was she?" Ruby asked quietly. Naruto's eyes drifted over to his partner, and he almost froze at the support and warmth that shone from her silver eyes. He took a shuddering breath and closed his eyes momentarily. "Her name was Hinata Hyuga." He took out a picture, much like he did with Konoha, although he held this much more tenderly and with more love. It depicted a beautiful girl with dark blue hair that went to the middle of her back, with bangs framing her face. Her eyes were white, with a hint of lavender that combined with that lavender and purple accents of kimono she was wearing. The gentle smile she wore seemed to perfectly fit her face. All in all, it actually made the woman in attendance feel a little jealous. Despite being in the same academy class together, I never actually realized that she had feelings for me until we were 15 going on 16. I was quite dense back then about such things. For Shinobi, she was incredibly kind and gentle, always going out of her way to help others, but that was just the way she was. She was rather shy at first when we began talking to each other, but soon opened up to me fully. We had only begun dating for about 5 months when I asked her to marry me, and she didn't even hesitate to say yes. It was the happiest day of my life. He spoke, his voice unavailably cracking at the end. The students even swore they saw tears gathering in his eyes. So soon? Blake asked. Naruto hummed. At this point, we had just kicked you off the mainland and knew you would eventually return. Aware that in our line of work either of us could easily die, I decided to ask her to marry me. We both loved each other more than anything in the world and knew that if we made it out alive, that we wanted to spend the rest of our lives together. The wedding was set for a few months later, a couple of days before we predicted your return, and we couldn't wait for the day to come along. Naruto sighed deeply but refused to let any tears fall. He had promised her he wouldn't. He clutched the jewel tighter and said nothing more. Not there was anything else to say. They all knew she had been killed. He resisted the urge to snarl when the image of Sasuke appeared in his mind. "What's that?" Blake questioned after a while, gesturing to the jewel in her teammate's hand. Naruto looked down at the blue-green jewel in his hand, the same one Tsunade had given him. "This was my engagement ring. I didn't feel like going with tradition, so I gave her the most precious thing I had. This," he explained simply. "How much is it worth?" Yang asked in curiosity. "No idea, just that it's enough to buy 3 mountains full of gold, with some left over to buy an island." He shrugged, ignoring the wide eyes of his friends. We sputtered, "That's more than the half the entire SDC fortune," only to realize a moment later she drew attention to herself and suddenly snapped up again. Naruto sighed once again and polished off his drink and discarded that was what was left. "Whis, come here," he commanded softly, turning to face them. When she didn't move, there was a gentle shove in her back, and she suddenly found herself in front of the man she desperately wanted to avoid right now. He placed his hands on the girl's shoulders. "Relax, I'm not going to hurt you." And this that he moved his hands and placed his fingers on her temple and his thumb underneath her eyes. Louise had closed her eyes when Kitsune had reached for her face, afraid of what he might do. When nothing had happened and she felt them retract, she gathered the courage to open her eyes. She was glad that she did. It seemed as if the sea itself had turned green, and the hills stretched for miles in each direction until she couldn't see them anymore. Flowers of all colors and sizes that she didn't recognize swayed gently in an imaginary breeze. It was beautiful. "Where am I?" she wondered. "My manscape, I brought you here so we could talk," a voice behind her said. She snapped around instantly to see she was standing on an open platform with a high roof. In the center sat a low table that held a pot of presumably tea and 2 cups. A pillow sat on either side, only one was occupied. Whis looked startled that there was someone else with her, and even frightened when she realized she was all alone with Kitsune of all people. She suddenly felt very self-conscious with the way he was studying her, his eyes racking over her form. "That looks good on you. Come sit." She was confused. Wasn't she wearing what she usually did? She looked down and was surprised to see that she was missing her usual dress, combat skirt, and in its place a pure white kimono with little blue snowflakes and accents. She looked back up and noticed that Kitsune was wearing a kimono himself, pitch black with a dark orange outline and sash around the waist. Although she hated to admit it, it actually made him rather handsome, even with the mask. "What?" she asked eventually. "Sit. Have some tea. Although it's not real, it still tastes the same." Naruto gestured to the pillow this time and poured some tea into the cup opposite him. Whis cautiously sat down, still not entirely sure what was happening. "Why? I thought you hated me." Naruto sighed and took a sip of his own tea. "I fear I have been rather rash and blamed the sins of the father on the son, or in this case, daughter," Naruto began. "Though to be fair, you didn't help in that regard." The normal Whis flared up despite the situation. "How do you mean?" she demanded. Naruto's eyes flicked up. "To put it simply, you're a bitch." "Excuse me!" Whis yelled indignantly. Naruto held up a hand and counted off. You're overly prideful, arrogant, generally know-it-all, rude, and you have a complete disregard for others' feelings other than yourself. We sputtered as she tried to raise an argument. Naruto's eyes hardened. Tell me I'm wrong. We fell silent. All right, I guess I can be a little difficult to deal with, she conceded under the intense scrutiny of the shinobi opposite her. Naruto nodded. Good. The first step of solving a problem is admitting it exists, he encouraged. Wait, why are you trying to help me? We asked accusingly. Because I care for my friends, and if helping you get over your daddy issues is what it takes to do that, then so be it. We looked affronted. How dare you? Naruto merely raised a brow and she fell silent again. This time he didn't break it with a question, or rather, they simply sat there drinking tea in silence. It was rather calming, actually. Why is it you hate me and my people so much anyway? It can't be the influence of your father, he asked after what must have been hours. Whis frowned and set her cup down. My sister, Whis is part of the Special Operative Unit in Atlas. Naruto hummed. I remember them. A particular pain in the ass, he commented. They and our Ambu clashed often if I remember correctly. He recalled his own interaction with their own version of the remnant Black Ops division. Whis looked horrified. Wait, the Ambu are real? Naruto snorted. Of course they are. People here only thought otherwise because your leaders didn't want to admit they were getting their asses kicked when they thought they were superior. His own pride shone slightly at that, having personally dispatched a few units himself, but it was hidden well and we didn't seem to notice. Their special forces were nothing more than a joke to most shinobi in the Ambu Corps. They were trying to play in the big boy playground when they had yet to master the sand pit. It was rather disappointing, actually. We frowned at that as well. The Ambu were notorious for being nothing but shadows and ruthless killers, soldiers and huntsmen alike. One in particular struck fear in any heart, no matter how brave they thought they were. Yes, well, it was towards the end of the war, and Winter's team was sent on a mission to locate a stragging ground for your shinobi in water country. They found it, and on the way back was spotted by a passing patrol. They tried to make a break for it, but were slowly killed off one by one by a Perusian shinobi until only my sister was left. Instead of killing her like the others, they captured her and brought her back to their camp for interrogation. Of course, they didn't interrogate first. We choked slightly. They tried to rape her in front of a laughing audience. Naruto's eyes narrowed suddenly. This story seemed familiar. Tried? Huis nodded as tears poured down her cheeks. Someone stopped it before they could, ordered some people to take care of her as she was now under his protection. That's good. Do you know who? We shook her head this time. She never told me. Naruto nodded. Well, I can certainly understand your position. I myself hate the thought of rape, but having no sibling, I could never understand the idea of it possibly happening to them. Naruto leaned over and wiped the tears from Whis' porcelain cheeks. Whis nodded and looked at Naruto in a different fashion. No siblings? Are you an only child? She asked curiously. Naruto nodded. Never knew my parents either. Died the day I was born. Whis looked shocked. Although her father was a less than stellar version of a parent, and her mother had sadly died also not long after she was born due to illness, she at least had Winter to look after and care for her. I'm sorry I didn't know, she apologized. Naruto waved her off, however. Don't worry, I've long since come to accept that little fact. Besides, I can still have a family of my own. Naruto finished his tea and set the cup down. Come on, we've been in here long enough. We suddenly shut up. It must have been in a few hours. The others must be worried sick. Naruto chuckled and stood as well. Worry not. Time passes differently in here. It's been a few seconds outside, and with that, Whis vanished. You can come out now, he commanded as he walked off the hardwood floor and onto the grass. There was a shuffling behind him, and a large orange mass sat down beside him. You're being too close to your friends, it spoke deeply. I'll be the judge of that, and if hostilities resume and you're forced to kill them, then I won't hesitate. Like you hesitated with the Uchiha? Naruto said nothing and received a dark chuckle in return. Remember, I'm in your head. I know everything you think and feel. Spare me your words, Fox. If it comes down to it, I'll massacre the whole school if I'm ordered to. That you should know. He snapped angrily. That wasn't There was another chuckle. I know. That's what I love about this new Naruto. Not afraid to get your hands covered in blood to get the job done. Naruto was silent again, and so was the fox. He was right, though. If it came down to it, would he choose his new bonds or his loyalty? End of chapter 8.